Content warning. Racism, Nazism, and bad fascist history. Suicide, depression, slavery, rape. Action! Excitement! Horror, romance,
Thrills and chills,
swords and sorcery,
rockets and ray guns,
a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
Down the long twilight ages of man's history, remembered and unremembered, in the brute recesses of the mind, whence dwells still the shadow of the primitive, echoes a name of legend, a warrior, a mercenary, a barbarian, refugee from a savage land, come to a decaying ancient kingdom that was old before the first strokes of our history were set to paper, raised up by his own hand to rule an empire. He is Kull. Sorry, were you expecting someone else? Hi there. Welcome to What Mad Universe, the podcast about the elder days of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, especially in the pulps. I am Adam Prosser, and with me, as always, is Philip Rice.
Hello.
Hello. And today, what we were going to take a look at, specifically, was the character of Kull, the Exile of Atlantis. A character created by Robert E. Howard, who is, of course, the same guy who created Conan the Barbarian and Solomon Kane in the 1920s. Kull is kind of an interesting character, though, because he's actually, he predates Conan, and in many ways he is the ancestor of Conan. But I find him, in many ways, a more interesting character than Conan as well. So I kind of steered the debate this week because I was a fan of Howard's stuff, and I have a collection of his stuff, and I gave it to Phil. But so Phil, you've never actually really read the Conan stories, right?
No. I read one Solomon Kane and found it a little racist. And
it's extremely racist. There's no getting around the Solomon Kane stories. That's another way.
It was well written, but I just at the time I wasn't really into it because of the. I'm used to racism from 19th century books, but
right.
it was a little more than I was expecting at that particular moment in time, and it just sort of overwhelmed me a bit. I have read.
That's another way in which the Kull stories are better than the Conan and Solomon Kane stories, is that there's not really any racism in them in the way that there is in those other stories. Sorry,
he has his best friend is dark skinned.
Right.
He's a Pict, but it seems to be different from the historical Picts in some ways.
Yeah. But anyway, so it's and for what it's worth, well, I mean, I'm sure we'll do a show about Solomon Kane someday, but for what it's worth, Solomon Kane stories do get less racist, marginally less racist as they go on. The first one is really just appallingly over the top in terms of racism. They become slightly less. They became more noble savage stuff as it goes on. Anyway,
which isn't much. I mean, it's
not much better, but it's a little. It's less painfully bad.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I am a fan of Lovecraft, despite his being a horrible human being, and that's mostly where I know Howard from.
Right.
As part of the Lovecraft circle, and I've the only places I've really read his work beyond Solomon Kane was in the occasional Lovecraft mythos collection.
Right. Well,
he wrote a few Cthulhu mythos, so-called stories.
Yeah, there were a few of them who hung out, or didn't hang out. I guess they corresponded with H.P. Lovecraft, to Clark Jackson Smith, Clive Tevis, I think his name was. There were a few of them anyway, but
Robert Bloch was a younger one.
Right, Robert Bloch, who went on. He was the author of Psycho, the
Yep.
book, later on, and wrote some Star Trek episodes eventually, which is kind of fun. But the Cull stories, and actually the Conan stories as well, and some of the other stuff Howard wrote, is what's called antediluvian fantasy. It was something that was sort of all the rage around that time. I think it kind of got started around the late 19th century, but it had really become a huge fashion in the pulps by the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s, which is basically, well, just to define terms here, you got secondary world fantasy, which is the idea of a world that is complete. There's fantasy set in our world, and there's fantasy set in a world which, is created with its own, lands and people and rules, essentially, as we all know. And antediluvian fantasy is the idea of fantasy that took place in a historical period before recorded history, essentially. Which is,
antediluvian, by the way, literally means before the flood.
Before the flood, yes, exactly. And it's kind of based on ideas that scientists had briefly in the 19th century. For instance, the idea of the continent of Lemuria, which is the basis for my comic, Lemuria, which is, it was based on the idea that they noticed lemurs appeared. They believed lemurs were linked to different species throughout the world. So they said, oh, well, there must have been a continent called Lemuria that the lemurs came from originally. So that became the basis of, there's a lost kingdom, there's a lost continent. And of course, Plato wrote about Atlantis. You know more about that, right, Phil?
Yeah, it's, as far as we can tell, he made it up. I mean, it doesn't predate any.
Right.
It doesn't predate Plato at all.
Right.
As far as we can tell, he claims it came from an Egyptian pharaoh, but
right.
That's probably just a framing story for his.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Plato
it's a metaphor, basically.
Yeah. Plato was writing fiction. I think there was. They sort of think there might have been some like an island that, like a volcanic eruption somewhere in the Mediterranean at some point, which might have inspired that kind of legend.
Yeah,
which would
but
have
the whole thing about the concentric circles of water and the
right.
The giant landmass with a great kingdom who fought with Athens.
Right.
It's all. In fact, even some ancient Greek writers made fun of that story.
Right.
Theopompus wrote we only have a fragment of it, but he called it Meropis. And it was so large it made the continents of Afro-Eurasia look like small islands. And it was populated by giants, and they invaded Hyperborea instead of Athens. And that's where they lost. And all this was communicated by a centaur.
Right.
To King Midas.
Right. And that was all kind of a parody of Plato,
exactly.
right?
It's like taking everything to the next extreme level.
Right. So it was a common sort of idea going as we say, as far back as the ancient Greeks. Just that there was a kingdom, or a land that existed and is lost and is submerged in many ways, and that does tend to pop up all throughout the world. Even the Chinese talk about I'm going to forget his name, Baron Lao, I think. Anyway, one of the great ancestors of the Chinese dynasties was a guy who helped stave a flood that supposedly swept through China in like the time before time, sort of. So it's a really ancient sort of legend.
Yeah, and there's in South American and Central American mythology, there's Aztlan, which is where the Mesoamerican people came from, supposedly.
Oh, really? I didn't know that one. Okay, yeah, it's a common, especially when you look at the Middle East, especially, and it seems quite likely, especially when you look at the Tigris and Euphrates, they probably flooded a lot. The Nile famously flooded very regularly. And still does, as far as I know. But all through the world, there's sort of these flood legends of, there was a great civilization. I know that a lot of pre-Columbian civilizations, both in South and North America, have legends of there was the first world and the second world and the third world, and they would get destroyed. I believe the Mayans had it that there had been a world that was destroyed by jaguars, and
I
then
didn't know
come
that one.
back. Yeah, and then they were on like the fifth world, I think.
The
first
Jaguar Apocalypse.
there was a jaguar apocalypse, yeah, which is kind of cool. So it was definitely a common thing throughout mankind. The Robert E. Howard stories are set on at a kingdom that he made up called Volusia on the continent of Thuria, and in his time frame, Kull, who's actually an Atlantean. But Atlantis is actually a very primitive land at this point, and it's the Thurians, the Volusians, and the Seven Empires, as he calls them, which are this ancient, decaying kingdom that's older than time. And this is a time when even Atlantis hasn't risen to prominence, and Lemuria is mentioned, but it's very primitive as well. So it just shows you like this is meant to be just beyond the scope of recorded history and way back into an imaginary past. So that was a common setting. There were a few people that Howard was inspired by.
Sorry, that's what I found really interesting about it. It sort of reminded me of if you've seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They have the idea that the Earth is far older than science says it is.
Yeah,
I like the idea of a old Earth that had all these cultures and things that popped up and collapsed before we even have recorded history.
right.
And the idea of this cyclical rise and fall of empires, sort of reflecting real history in some way, but exaggerating it into a distant past.
Yeah. Well, what's actually interesting is Robert E. Howard. He was a pulp writer, of course, I think his first story was sold around 1924, and it was a story called Spear and Fang, and it was actually a story about cavemen, and that was actually a popular pulp basis. 1924 it was written. It was actually a popular basis for pulp fantasy and not necessarily fantasy even. They claim to be historical stories, but set in the time of the savage time of cave people. I've been able to find evidence that it went back as far as the 19th century, and oddly enough, it was. Your favorite Metro, the 19th century French sci-fi writers, who wrote a story called Paris Before Man in the 1860s, which is literally, a caveman story. It's about the primitive peoples. And then there's a guy called Andrew Lang who came along later, and he apparently wrote some caveman fiction. So believe it or not, caveman fiction was pretty popular, not even necessarily with a fantastical element, just stories of savage tribesmen surviving. That was one of the staples of the pulp. And the antediluvian fantasy kind of married that to something with, something with more civilizations and more kingdoms and things like that.
And also supernatural elements.
Yeah, and then you bring in the supernatural stuff. It's kind of the idea of what if a caveman was set loose in a china shop. Set loose in a china shop, that is civilization. That was kind of the appeal. And it's also tied in with some of the ideas that, again, scientists were having at that time, which are more or less accurate, that there had been certain waves of people like, there was definitely a group of people that swept across Asia and into Europe around probably about 5,000 years ago. Correct. I apologize if I'm getting some of the facts wrong. I'm not a historian, but I believe there was a group. They became known. I think it's because they had the chariot, so they were really kicking ass, technologically throughout Eurasia, and they were known as the Hyksos in Europe or in Egypt. I think they were the Ionians or the Pelasgians in Greece. They branched off into all these different tribes, and then in India, they were known as the Vedic Aryans. And of course, the name Aryan is the thing that got seized on as, oh yeah, these were the great superior people. And unfortunately, that led to some crack pottery that led to some really bad stuff in Europe, unfortunately.
Definitely.
That was kind of the stuff Hitler seized on, even though he was talking about Aryans who were literally Indian, Central Asian people. So I'm not sure how he got so fixated on the idea that they were Germans, but that was his thing. But certainly we do know that there was some kind of technological revolution about 5,000 years ago. And this is kind of the thing that was inspiring Robert E. Howard when he wrote these stories. So like I say, and like I say, the first story he ever published was this caveman story. Apparently he wrote some stories about someone named Amra, who I don't I don't know much about. It looks like he didn't get those published. And again, it was sort of...
Wasn't Amra featured in the first Cull story?
Yes, that's right. Amra, yes. So Cull is... Amra's kind of he was... The way I've heard it's written about in some of the books, is that Amra was the focus of the story, and then Cull kind of came in as a supporting character and took over. And that was the story that was eventually known as Exile of Atlantis, which is very much a caveman story, but it kind of gets a fantastical sheen to it because it's set in Atlantis.
Yeah.
And then Cull kind of ran off, and he literally says, I want to go off and become a king. And then next time we meet him, he's the king of an ancient kingdom called Valusia.
He's exiled from Atlantis for granting a quick death to someone who's going to be tortured to death.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And that first story is they're sacrificing a woman.
So it sort of starts with a bit of compassion from our lead character, which isn't really what you expect from these barbarian characters.
Well, then that's something we can talk about.
Yeah.
I think some of the whole idea that it's all this Nietzschean chest thumping is not always 100% accurate. But it is true that you could metaphorically see it as Cull sort of leaving the barbarian caveman era behind and literally murdering someone and leaving it behind and going off to a new genre, sort of. And in fact, it's interesting because then after Cull, he wrote Conan, and in fact one of the Cull stories was rewritten. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they were rewritten to be the first Conan story. And so there's almost a progression of Robert E. Howard's characters where they were, he has one character who sort of evolves and then leaps forward thousands of years and becomes a new time setting until eventually he's dealing with the historical
Conan
characters.
takes place after Atlantis sinks, right? So
that's right.
It's
quite a bit later.
Yeah, quite a bit later.
The Cull stories are set, I believe technically they're supposed to be 100,000 years before our time, and the Conan stories are supposed to be set something like 15,000 years before our time. So quite a bit later. And it is often implied that they're sort of reincarnations of each other as they go down the years, or at the very least ancestors of each other, because it's very clear that Conan is definitely of Atlantean descent, and of course, you got Bran MacMorn, and there's even a Cull story where Bran MacMorn and Cull cross over, and he literally says, I call up the spirit of one of my ancient ancestors. And
I
Cull,
believe it was, wasn't Brule his ancestor?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's actually Brule, not
Cull.
Well, not Cull. Although the Bran MacMorn story, basically, he does say one of my ancestors, if I'm not mistaken, and Cull comes forward. Or he says one of our ancient kings of our tribe come forward.
I think it explicitly said Brule was the ancestor of his tribe. So.
Right. But anyway, they call on Cull as like their ancient ancestor or their ancient tribal guardian. So that's kind of, anyway, there's clearly a link down the ages between the different characters, and it's almost like he as his writing evolved, he literally jumped thousands of years, and the characters evolved, and they started as cavemen and ended up as historical. So there's kind of an interesting, progression in that sense. And even Conan evolved as a character over the years because he was one of his most popular characters. So he stuck with Conan, but Conan evolves a bit from how he first is created. So that's kind of an interesting progression that he wrote about in his stories. In my humble opinion, obviously Cull gave way to Conan because by this Axii rule, the Cull story was rewritten as The Phoenix on the Sword, which is the first Conan story. In my personal opinion, the Cull stories are superior to the Conan stories because Conan is dime store Nietzsche, a libertarian fantasy in which anything, even the supernatural, can be defeated with steel, thews, and iron will. Okay, maybe I'm oversimplifying a bit, although though that's the main message of most of Howard's imitators seem to have taken from the Conan story, just that sort of chest-thumping idea.
And the movie actually starts with a Nietzsche quote, so...
Exactly, yes. Well, we'll talk about the movie in a minute,
Yeah.
both the Conan movie and the Kull movie in a minute. But yeah, it's the people who latched onto Howard in the 1960s definitely seem to have been really taken with the wild, free spirit of, oh, I just do whatever I want, and I'm such a badass, I can get away with whatever I want, which is interestingly not the real theme of the Kull stories. Kull is more nuanced and layered. He appeals less to the male id, which probably explained why he had trouble getting published compared to Conan. Both Conan and Kull become kings, but many of Conan's adventures are set in his wild days as a reaver and an outlaw. We never get the story of how Kull rose to the throne of Valusia. It's only referenced in passing in a few stories, and described as relatively easy. The Kull stories are far more about the challenges of keeping power, something that can't always be accomplished with a sword through the belly. Sure, there's a bit of the chest-thumping machismo of the Conan stories, particularly the ending of By This Axe I Rule, but whereas Conan is about the strength of brute simplicity over the corrupting influence of civilization, Kull is more reflective when confronted by the staggering antiquity of his newly claimed kingdom. Consider this passage from the Shadow Kingdom. "You are young," said the palaces and the temples and the shrines, "but we are old. The world was wild with youth when we were reared. You and your tribe shall pass, but we are invincible, indestructible. We towered above a strange world ere Atlantis and Lemuria rose from the sea. We shall still reign when the green waters sigh for many a restless fathom above the spires of Lemuria and the hills of Atlantis, and when the isles of the western men are the mountains of a strange land. How many kings have we watched ride down these streets before Kull of Atlantis was even a dream in the mind of Ka, bird of creation? Ride on, Kull of Atlantis. Greater shall follow you. Greater came before you. They are dust. They are forgotten. We stand. We know. We are. Ride. Ride on, Kull of Atlantis. Kull the king. Kull the fool." Kull's thinking, "Ho, awake, Valusia. It is Kull that rides. Kull the king." "We have known many kings," said the silent halls of Valusia. So you see, like, he's not just going in for the same kind of stuff that he goes in for later with Conan. Kull is changed by his experiences in a ruler in a way Conan isn't. He's aware of his own mortality and the sweep of history. He fights against it, but in the end, whatever greatness he brings to Valusia is long gone. Even the name is lost to our present era. So there's a bit more fatalism and bleakness to the Kull stories than the Conan stories.
Yeah, they're a lot more introspective than I was expecting, really, going in. I should mention, this is... Well, I've already mentioned, but Robert E. Howard is kind of a blind spot in terms of pulp for me.
Right.
And I've always been meaning to get to them, but I was going to start with Conan, but I'm glad I started with Kull because it seems more interesting in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, the Conan stories are also interesting. Don't get me wrong. And again, I'm sure we'll do a story about an episode about Conan down the line. It's interesting to read about Robert E. Howard and what his thoughts and views were. He seems like he was very willing to write what he thought the audience wanted. Even Conan had these implications early on of being a more layered character, a bit more flawed. And it seems like his editors basically... Farnsworth Wright was the editor of, I believe, Weird Tales at the time. And he was very much shaping Howard's stuff. And Howard was like, I'll write what I need to write to be successful. So he basically said... he'd take out that bit that's too, nuanced. I just want a hero who, kicks ass and kills some monsters and has sex with some chicks, basically. That seems to have been the way Farnsworth Wright encouraged him to write. And it sounds like Howard basically said, okay, I'll go in that direction, which is not to say that he didn't have his own individualist ideas, but he did say, I remember him complaining later about Conan. He felt Conan was getting to be too much of a bastard, basically. So it's not necessarily his own viewpoints so much as him kind of appealing to his audience to a certain degree. But it's hard to say where the line is because it's also very personal stories in many ways. But yeah, the Nietzschean thing is very big in his mind, Robert E. Howard. But he also, obviously he doesn't. The Conan stories tend to the cliche of the Conan stories is that civilization is bad and Conan is good. He'll come in and sort everything out by hacking everything into pieces, and all those corrupt nobles will cower in his wake, and he'll conquer everything through his sheer force of will. And even the Conan stories aren't really like that, but that's the cliche that we've had of the Conan stories.
There's a little bit of that in the Kull stories, I noticed. Like, early on it says, or in one of them, it says he wasn't yet civilized enough to be cruel, or something along those lines.
That's right, yeah. He definitely plants the idea of your, barbarians are better in many ways than civilized people, because he said you have to be polite to a barbarian because otherwise you might get an axe through your skull. That was another quote from somewhere else. I think that's in one of the Conan stories. But he doesn't portray civilization as like completely irredeemably awful in the Kull stories either, which is something that the Conan imitators tended to take.
What I found interesting is Kull is sort of an extra barbarian because he's from Atlantis, but he's also was a feral child in Atlantis.
Right. Yeah.
And he was his own. I can't remember if they ever explained this, but his tribe was lost or something, and he was raised by another tribe.
Yeah, there's actually,
and they found him in the woods, just living among the animals.
Right. Yeah. That's another thing, Howard, and it plays into Conan to a slight degree too, because Conan's from Samaria, but he never talks about why he left Samaria. He sort of hints that there was some kind of tragedy that drove him out of his land, but they never get into it. So in many ways, that's kind of ported over from Kull. He literally says Kull goes, "Oh yeah, I was a hairless ape roaming around with no words or sanity or anything." So it's almost a mystery of his origin too, which they never delve into. He doesn't delve into because he never really. By the way, only 3 Kull stories were published: the Shadow Kingdom, the Mirrors of Tuzun Thun, and the Kings of the Night, which is the crossover with Bran McMorn. And I believe Exile of Atlantis was published, but it's arguably not a Kull story. So most of the Kull stories that we have were published decades later when there was a boom of Robert E. Howard, basically, as with a lot of the Conan stories and the Solomon Kane stories and everything else. So you can see why he kind of left Kull behind and moved on to Conan, because he was having trouble getting it published, basically.
Yeah. In the afterword, it had a lot of lines from Howard, writing to his friends and whatnot, and he seemed very frustrated by the lack of sales he was getting on his stories at that time. So
we should mention, of course, I don't know if you know this, he did end up committing suicide, Robert E. Howard, in the 1930s after his mom passed on. So unfortunately, he may have had some issues, unresolved mental issues. People have tended to say, and that may actually show up in some of the stories that he wrote. There's actually implications that Conan suffers from basically depression, which is, again, a very interesting aspect of the character that Farnsworth Wright wanted to downplay and cut out, because it's kind of a downer, I guess, and that's I guess why they didn't like the Kull stories as much, because they're a bit more. I mean, they're still heroic by today's standards. You wouldn't say they were downers, but there's more of a sort of stop, think who you are, where are you, where are you going, what's the sweep of history, whereas Conan is just fucking inviting, basically.
I'm familiar with Farnsworth Wright from. He was also Lovecraft's editor on Weird Tales, and Lovecraft and another writer whose name I can't remember offhand, but they co-wrote a story set on Venus that featured a bunch of animals that were named after various people in the pulp world. And one of them was the Farnoth flies, who were these annoying buzzing things, was named after Farnsworth Wright. There was also wriggling creatures and moss and whatnot, and they were all named after editors and famous fans and so forth.
Okay.
So Venus was just a horrible, slimy swamp area.
Okay. So they found Farnsworth Wright to be annoying, is what you're saying.
It would seem so, yes.
Yeah. That's kind of funny. He was definitely, but they had to make money off the pulp, so he was very, very straightforward to that. But going back a bit to the whole idea of antediluvian fantasy and where it comes from, it does tend to derive from I mentioned the scientific ideas that they had, and again, it was fairly more or less legitimate science at the time, but they abandoned the hypotheses fairly quickly. But crackpots kind of cracked onto them, and there was a particular lady named Blavatsky, and maybe you'd like to talk about that a bit.
I hate Blavatsky. I'm just gonna say this. I've done a bunch of research into occult beliefs and whatnot. I find Blavatsky almost incomprehensible. I found I was very excited to find an audiobook of one of her books. I believe it was the I can't remember which one, but it was. I discovered it was 5 days long, literally like 5 straight days through. Without sleep. And I listened to I tried to listen to it. I listened to about 2 hours of it, and I didn't understand any of it because she doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I think that's actually part of the point of those sort of charlatans. They tended to ramble and use a lot of buzzwords. And,
there was a lot of appropriation from Indian culture.
Right.
That would be India. A lot of Hindu ideas and Buddhist ideas sort of meshed together, and obviously she didn't understand a lot of it, and obviously she was making up a lot of it. She, like you said, she was a total charlatan, but she was very influential. She was hugely influential in the spiritualism movement of the time.
When was she? She was late 1800s?
Yeah. I believe the book in question was written in 1888, so late 1800s.
Right. And then, so that kind of, and it's, Robert E. Howard, you read some of his letters and he's like, I don't really believe this stuff, but it's good for writing fantasy and sci-fi, basically.
I feel the same way about a lot of this stuff. In my own writing, I often crib from things that I don't believe in, but it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, because she talked about like ancient kingdoms and lost lands.
Lemuria and Atlantis were particularly, like, she helped popularize those things as real things that supposedly existed.
Right.
Because Atlantis wasn't believed in literally until the Victorian era, really.
Right.
There was a book called it has a very long title, but it popularized the idea that Atlantis was a real place. It was supposedly a scientific historical work, though it had a lot of flaws. But the Theosophists, which Blavatsky was the head of, was sort of one of the leaders of Theosophy, they sort of picked up on it, and they really ran with it. And they came up with this idea of root races, or sort of ancestors of mankind, not in the Darwinian sort of evolutionary sense, but like they started off as purely spiritual beings, and then helped along by Venusians and that sort of nonsense.
Venusians,
I read one book called Of Atlantis and Lost Lemuria by a theosophist, and they talk about the Lemurians as 10-foot tall ape-like beings with black skin and a third eye on the back of their head. It also gets really racist by saying the closest living relatives are the Aborigines of Australia. So, like, what are you doing, dude?
Of course, no, it's. I mean, it was. They were clearly, they knew they could, entrance people with kind of mystic sounding stuff, which seems to have been huge at the time.
But they had root races and. Lemuria was supposedly the birthplace of humanity.
Right.
And then they moved to Atlantis and then off into the other areas.
I think one of the things that might have inspired this a little, like the reason that people might have been more accepting of that, was there was around that time, I believe, there was the German guy whose name I can't remember, who was an archaeologist, and he basically said, "I'm going to find the ruins of Troy," and everyone said, "What are you talking about? Troy is a fantasy. It was a mythological place. It didn't actually exist." And then he did actually find ruins that corresponded roughly to probably what was actually the ancient Troy in Turkey. And so people suddenly were maybe a little more accepting that the
Yeah.
mythology was real, basically, even though that was based on actual, careful study and research and stuff at the time. And he acknowledged, like, of course it's been mythologized over the years, but there probably was a real place called Troy.
Well, like they always say, they laughed at Einstein, but they also laughed at
Yeah.
Bozo the Clown or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just because people are laughing at you doesn't mean you're wrong necessarily. There's another aspect of sort of the weird occultist mystic mindset that ties into Kull, which is the fact that in his one of his most famous stories, The Shadow Kingdom, and one of the only ones that was published, he fights snake people,
Yes.
who are the hidden puppet masters of the kingdom, basically.
Yes. So this is an idea. He seemed to have been inspired by Blavatsky directly. There's one mention of Lemuria being ruled by dragon people, though it might be a metaphor. They might not be literal lizard people. Mm-hmm. They might just be humans who... But supposedly Lemuria sank because they were using so much dark magic and so forth. So this is probably where he got it from. But from the Shadow Kingdom, it got picked up into mainstream conspiracy theory circles
Right.
almost immediately by other authors who just sort of wrote the same thing but taking it seriously.
Right.
And eventually that led to David Icke really like blowing it up in terms of popularity.
Right.
He's a well-known conspiracy theorist, if you don't know. Mm-hmm. And there's this massive monomyth sort of explaining the history of the world by us being controlled by shape-shifting lizard people.
Right.
Who feed off our misery and come
Yeah.
from another dimension and all these other weird things.
Yeah.
And it might have originated from Kull, so
Yeah.
thanks, Kull.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is something that seems to have been. Do you know? Do you know how it's tied to David Icke specifically? Like, has he said that, or like, did he said he read one of these other authors?
One of the early writers whose name I can't remember. It was in my notes that I forgot to bring.
That's okay.
Sorry.
We'll edit it in.
Yeah. But in the 40s, wrote about supposed tablets that were found that discuss the history of the snake people.
Right.
And David Icke, it was one of his primary inspirations for writing his books about lizard people.
Yeah. 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 No,
David Icke has an interesting way of dealing with sort of mixing popular culture and real mythology and fake mythology and sort of urban folklore. Say the lizard people are also very similar to the aliens from V or
Right.
the movie They Live. It's pretty much just They Live,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
mixed with some anti-Semitism.
Right. Yeah. V. The miniseries V was definitely inspired by David Icke. I know that.
No, it's the other way around. It predated David Icke talking about this
Oh,
stuff.
really?
Yeah.
But then there were people who Icke was being inspired by.
Yeah,
with the
exactly. But
reptilian-
Icke, it predates Icke. Icke came out with this stuff in the 90s.
Right.
So he was going off of a century of history, but it wasn't that popular till he took hold of it.
Yeah, that's it's always interesting, and I mean that's always something that's interesting to me, how pop culture gets weirdly inspired, and I mean even to a certain degree, real ideas can come out of like pulp sci-fi in some weird ways.
Yes. It's said that the Barney and Betty Hill were the first sort of abductees by aliens, supposedly.
Right. Yeah.
By gray aliens, anyway. The modern gray aliens.
Right.
When they first described them, they had big noses like Jimmy Durante.
Okay.
That was directly described, and slicked black hair.
Yeah.
And then an episode of The Outer Limits came on with sort of gray, well, it's black
Yeah.
and white, but sort of similar big-headed aliens.
Right.
And after that, a hypnosis session revealed that that's what the aliens look
Right,
like.
right.
So that's where the grays come from
Yeah.
initially.
Yeah.
And I mean, it
Well, even
also,
the flying saucers were pulp stories from I was reading about that in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah,
which kind of got watered, and people kept translating it, and it became more. And of course, the fiction writers would say, "Oh, this is a real account that I found
Yes.
in a bottle somewhere or whatever," and that slowly got translated.
well, there's
into
also
somebody...
the shaver mystery, which I'm sure we'll get into some point, because it was a real conspiracy theory that somebody believed, but it was published in pulp magazines.
Right.
And that's the that
Yeah.
also helped inspire the flying saucer thing, though they came from underground in that case.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's all It was a guy who managed to get use the pulps to get his ideas out. Basically,
Yeah.
I that's exactly the one I'm talking about. And then you can even I always like the idea that actually one of the big things that inspired Lenin, a couple of things that inspired Lenin were science fiction novels as well. He'd read novels about the utopian society, and they may have inspired him a lot. So there's always a weird crossover.
This is a little bit aside, but did you know that apparently Lord of the Rings was rewritten in the Soviet Union with the sci-fi edge to it?
I did not.
Okay, I haven't looked into that, but that would be something to look at, I think, in the future.
Sure.
Apparently, the fantasy thing was a bit too far for them.
Right, yeah.
So they censored it with...
the Soviet Union didn't like pure fantasy generally, unless it was explicitly for kids. So they... I know that was a thing. Anyway, that's getting a little off topic, but that's something to talk about. No, that's fine. But yeah, it is very interesting how you get this weird influence of pop culture and even just other philosophical ideas coming out of pulp novels. Do you want to talk about the movie?
Oh, how about a few of the stories first?
Okay.
The Mirrors of Tuzan Thun.
Yes.
That was that was the second one, sort of in the third, I guess. It
was the second one. It was the third one he wrote.
Yeah.
The third one, if we're including Exile, Atlantis, which again was not a Cull story, but introduces him, and then he kind of takes over.
But it takes place sort of Cull's a bit older in this one, so it's sort of a sequel to most of the other stories in the collection.
Right.
He's in his 40s or something, and he's getting melancholy and depressed, and so he goes to a wizard, or he's told to go to a wizard, and there's this house full of magic mirrors, and he gets sort of almost literally lost in one of them. And it's this very sort of indicative or representative of this idea of Cull as I think the back of the book describes him as the thinking man's barbarian.
Right, yeah. Well, it's sort of
very philosophical in some ways. Like, is this... And the Shadow Kingdom has it as well. Like, he's put off in his tracks by seeing one of the lizard people have shapeshifted into him, and he says, that can't be me. I'm me.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, it's especially the early Cull stories are very much about
identity?
Identity and just the idea of, well, I was just a guy who went around killing for a living, and now I'm in this new situation, and I'm suddenly in a position where I'm thinking all the time, and I don't like it. Kind of is the attitude. And if thinking is still kind of a trap, because like in the Tuzan Thun story, he almost gets defeated by crossing over into a mirror and getting sucked into possibly having his soul stolen, or possibly, as he says, maybe that would have taken him into another wonderful place beyond. He doesn't really know. So it's actually not 100% clear if Tuzan Thun was evil or if he was trying to help him. But the implication that, everyone goes, oh, we killed that evil sorcerer. But they kind of, the implication you're supposed to take is, well, what if he was trying to help me? And that was what happened,
This is chronologically one of the later Cull stories.
Basically
it's interesting
the last one.
that well, he goes off he sort of marches into an area unknown in one story, and that sort of ends there.
Right. But that is definitely the theme of like what happens when you stop killing and doing stuff and being a man of action and start thinking. And then there's the talking cat later on.
That was a weird story.
I like when I gave it to Phil and when he was reading it, he tweeted a picture of the movie "A Talking Cat" while he was reading that story.
It's a terrible movie with what's his face? Julia Roberts' brother. What's his name?
Eric Roberts.
Eric Roberts. Thank you. As voicing a talking cat who can only talk to everybody once. Yeah. It's an awful movie. And he sounds like he's going from a closet. Speaking of awful movies, we were going to discuss the Cull movie.
Yes, so the Cull movie. Yeah, so there. Well, we should actually again. We keep talking about Conan, but it's hard not to talk about Conan because he's related to Cull. Because the Conan the Barbarian movie from the early '80s by John Milius with Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan. The thing is, once you've read the Cull stories, you realize That's really more of an adaptation of Kull than it is the Conan the Barbarian.
Yes, it has the villain from the Talking Cat story.
Thulsa Doom,
Thulsa
exactly.
Doom, who actually has a skull face in the original story, but in the movie was played by James Earl Jones as a snake-themed villain.
Right.
Once again, the snake people sort of tying in there.
The snake people come from Kull. The fact that Kull's backstory is him being a slave who eventually escapes and like, although he doesn't really escape in the movie, but
Set free.
Conan is not a slave in the stories. Kull was a slave, and it sort of ties into him being. He never quite goes as far as to ban slavery, unfortunately, in his kingdom. But you can see he's kind of ambivalent about slavery once he becomes king because he doesn't like that. And then there's also the fact that what was the other tie into Kull? Thulsa Doom, that as you said, Thulsa Doom being the villain. He's a Kull villain. He's not a Conan villain. Conan's biggest villain is Thoth Amon. So I have no idea why he didn't just use Thoth Amon and made it Thulsa Doom instead. I guess he just liked the name or something.
Yeah, I mean, it has Doom in it.
It has Doom in the title. So it's really weird. And then so they did this Kull movie in the 90s, which ironically I'm told was planned as a Conan movie.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Conan's destiny is to become a king.
That's what I hear, but it did integrate a lot of the Kull storylines.
Yeah.
Interestingly, it's not a good movie. In fact, it's a terrible movie.
It's a terrible movie.
It starred Kevin Sorbo, by the way, TV's Hercules.
Yeah.
Or one of TV's Hercules.
And may I just say, disappointed!
Yes. Who's not good in the role. I mean, he's usually a charismatic guy, but he's just casted wrong for this part.
No.
Because Kull is not a wisecracker. He's not... Kevin Sorbo looks the part. He's a big, muscular, tall guy with long hair, but
right.
He's sort of this snarky,
right.
And he's a womanizer in the movie, like Conan was in the movie.
Yeah.
And Kull's not like that. He doesn't have any love interests in the stories.
No, they explicitly say he had no interest in women. Given that he has no interest in women and he hangs out with this other dude all the time, you have to wonder about Kull sometimes. Basically,
I'm sure if Kull were published today, there'd be lots of
shipping.
Kull Brule shipping. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they're very close friends and
right. And they were taking Kull. I mean, Kevin Sorbo was popular on Hercules, so they clearly just wanted to transplant that over into a movie where he's kind of a wisecracking guy.
And it starts off with rock music.
Yeah, there's lots of heavy metal,
which is really out of place in this because the Conan movie has lush orchestral score, and this has Yeah, exactly. And flames coming out at the beginning, and
it's very metal.
Yeah,
and Tia Carrera,
it doesn't fit with anything.
Yeah, and Tia Carrera turns into a demon, so it is a very heavy metal cover type movie.
Yeah.
I did feel like the writer was trying to integrate some of the interesting themes of Kull in the movie. Like, I think it's one of these things where the writer maybe was trying for something and then the director kind of muffed it up. But
I feel that it was sort of an adaptation of By This Axe I Rule. Sort of.
Well, that's
with that.
That's a very simple story. And By This Axe I Rule, I should just mention, as a Kull story, it's kind of the archetypal Kull story because it's him. He's presented with a dilemma. In this case, it's just a girl who wants to marry a boy who... but she's...
That happens a lot, by the way.
Yeah, it happens at least twice in the stories, yeah. But in this case, she's a slave, and he's a nobleman, and they want to get married, and the law says you can't do that. And Kull is kind of like... And his advisors basically say, no, you can't, even though you're
the
king...
law's written on these ancient tablets.
Right. And I mean, and they have a point. It's like the king can't just come in and do whatever he wants, and the law is what makes you the king. So... It ends, and then there's an assassination attempt, and Kull basically bursts out. And as the people who tried to kill him are lying dead at his feet, he basically does, "I'm fine. This is why I rule. By this axe, I'm going to change the law."
He smashes the tablets with his axe. And
I think that's only in the movie that he smashes the tablet. I don't think he does it in the story. Yeah,
Mandela effect.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a good image in the movie, and then he basically says, "Look, we're going to make we're gonna keep the laws that are just, and we're gonna throw out the old laws that don't have any purpose anymore. And if anyone has a problem with that, this is what I'm gonna. This is how I rule. I have this axe. You can come and take the throne yourself if you don't like it.
Yeah.
Which is it's funny to me because you can interpret it as basically be reasonable, rah! Or I will soak the streets with the blood of my enemies. I kind of like that. That's the conclusion.
I like the image of him using the axe as a scepter, which he says he'll do.
Yeah, exactly.
So I imagine all the other stories, he's just carrying around the axe on the throne.
Yeah, exactly. That becomes a symbol of his rule, which is kind of cool. And yeah, so the movie ends with that, and it's just such a good movie.
The movie has a thing about axes representing barbarians, because Kull's not actually good with a sword for some reason.
Right.
Or not that good, because he keeps losing to one of the villains. Like, it starts off with him losing a fight, which is an interesting way to go with your barbarian action movie.
Yeah, it is. Literally the first fight is him losing, and you don't... And not in a way that, like, makes him cool. It's just like, oh, that guy lost a fight.
Yeah. And he just sort of stumbles into being king. He just sort of happens to be there, and... I mean, he kills the king, I guess, but...
Right. Well, I liked it because he comes into the throne room. The king's basically making noise that nobody likes.
He's being the Mad King from Game of Thrones. Right.
He comes up, Kull kills him, and then the king, as he's lying dying, he goes, well, the throne should go to the guy who killed me, Kull. And he basically does it because he knows that's going to fuck everyone over, basically. Yeah. It's his revenge on everyone, basically, is to declare Kull.
But you get the feeling in the books, like, Kull, like... wanted this, like he wanted to, like, it was his goal from the time of leaving Atlantis to the time he took the throne, and he didn't have any idea what to do afterwards.
Right, exactly.
But and that was sort of what the stories are about. But this was something he actually, spent a long time working to achieve, and in the movie he just sort of stumbles into it.
Yeah, well, they want to get it out of the way fast is the thing in the movie, basically. But you're right, he does talk about how, he says it happened with relative ease in the books, but it was clearly a plot, and he was a mercenary, which is in the movie, I guess, but he's a mercenary, and then he rises to the top, and they basically decide, a bunch of them say, yeah, Kull should be king, and they overthrow the king, and he says it happened pretty easily because he's such a kick-ass soldier and man of action. But yeah, as you say, and that is another thing that, of course, Game of Thrones picked up on, the idea of once you've won the throne, what do you do?
Yeah.
You don't know what to do with it, basically.
There's something you mentioned when you were live tweeting the movie. It does deal with the issue of consent with slavery.
Yeah.
Which is not what you would expect from this movie, because he tries to sleep with one of his slaves, and she points out that...
if she doesn't fight him, she's like, I'm a slave, I gotta do what you say, but understand that I don't like you, and you're just using your prerogative as a king, and that kind of makes him go, oh, dude, you're right, which is funny because he was already a slave, so you should understand this already.
Yes.
But yeah, it is interesting that they put that in there, because there's always the fantasy of these kind of fantasy stories where, oh, willing slave girls will do my bidding, and it's like...
They're often very... These movies are often very rapey, and I wasn't expecting this particular movie to avoid that.
Yeah.
But it did, so...
Yeah, exactly.
Kudos, I suppose.
Yeah, kudos.
Bare minimum.
There's enough in there that makes you kind of go, this would be good if they did a real Kull movie. But again, we've essentially had 2 Kull movies, and one of them was the Conan the Barbarian movie.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure there's any need for another Kull movie, unfortunately. But
yeah, it did use Valka instead of Crom as the god that they worship, because Kull worships Valka.
Right.
And, of course, Conan famously worships Crom.
Right.
I mean, what they are is essentially the same thing. But
right.
They did use a lot of names and references to the Kull stories. So like you said, the writer seemed to know his or her stuff.
Yeah.
I assume his, but...
Yeah. No, it is, it's definitely, at least the first half hour or something had some... clever stuff in the script that made me go, okay, the writer's trying at least. But generally speaking, it's a very late
Tia
90s.
Carrere is the queen of Acheron, which is from the Conan stories, I believe.
Yeah,
I looked it up, and it's apparently an ancient kingdom in the Conan stories. So.
Yeah. So we get a Kull movie that uses a lot of the Conan stuff, and we get a Conan movie that uses a lot of the Kull stuff, basically.
Yeah. And no snake people. They had a bit of hinting at, because some of the evil priests had snake garb, but
there's a snake.
If you're going to adapt a Kull story, I'd go with the Hidden Kingdom, because it's it's in my opinion the best one.
I agree, but again, I feel like they felt like Conan already covered that, so they didn't want to like that. I think
Yeah,
that
but
was
the idea
implication.
of a conspiracy within the kingdom and all that.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of these things. As with Spider-Man, they've never quite done the Gwen Stacy story right, but they've done so many bits of it that it's hard that they would go back to the beginning and redo it at this point. So it's the same thing with Cull. Unfortunately, they've covered a lot of the territory that would make him interesting. But there you go.
I feel the same way about the John Carter or the John Carter movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Because those ideas have been copied so many times since the books came out,
Right.
but the movie doesn't seem that interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's the fate of pulp, unfortunately. Like I say, these things being around for centuries, and then they get integrated into all these other things. The sort of middle third of Return of the Jedi does a lot of the John Carter stuff better than John Carter in some ways. Anyway, so I think we're probably, unless you had something else you wanted to talk about, I think we're probably reaching the end here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should... next episode, we'll be covering one of my selections, Vampire City or La Ville Vampire by Paul Vaval.
Yeah.
Forgive my French, I don't speak it, so this is an English translation.
Yes.
This is a very obscure vampire novel from around 1875, so predating Dracula by quite a bit, and it's the weirdest vampire novel I've ever read, and that's saying something.
Yes, you get to see how weird vampires were before Dracula locked them into the popular imagination. So that'll be coming up next time. So in the meantime, we want to say goodbye. Thank you for all of us at What Mad Universe. I'm Adam, and this is Philip Rice.
Hello.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Our engineer and sound guy is Alex Ross. Thank you, Alex. The music is by Jack Fierick, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.